All right. I'm sure folks are going to be joining us over the next few minutes here, but let's go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of great stuff to get through today. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on our first Thorn hosted webinar of the year. My name is Lauren Farhat. I am part of the philanthropy team here at Thorn, and I will be your host for today. We are super looking forward to chatting more with you all on the subject of AI and child safety. And really, this is just one of many important conversations we hope to engage our community in throughout the year. So please do keep a lookout for more of these webinars to come. Also, a quick reminder, at the end of the webinar today, we will have a Q&A session. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function at any point during the presentation, and then we will do our best to answer as many of those as we can before we conclude. So before we dive in, I just want to note that talking about child sexual abuse is hard. It's like really, really hard. And you all are here today to engage in a very difficult subject matter. So with that, just a few wellness reminders for you all as we move through our discussion today. Just try to be mindful about taking a sip of water, planting your feet into the ground and stretching out a little bit, and most importantly, breathe. Often when we hear things that are hard, we tend to tense up and stop breathing for whatever reason that is. So just don't forget to breathe and remind yourself that you are safe. All right, so I know we got lots of familiar faces with us on this call today, but there are also quite a few new faces. So for those of you that are new to Thorn, Thorn is a nonprofit that builds technology to defend children from sexual abuse. Our team creates innovative products and programs that help law enforcement find child victims faster. We work with tech companies to detect and remove child sexual abuse material from their platforms. We provide parents and youth with digital safety resources, and we are proactive in advocating for effective policy and legislation in this issue space. So with that, why are we here today? We are here today to talk about a technology that has steadily made its way into our workplace chats, our lunchtime scrolling, and recent headlines haunting the many, many of us who have kids in their lives. An example of a news story that some of you might be familiar with is one that took place this past January to 17-year-old Marvel actress Sauchel Gomez. Sauchel was the target of AI-generated deepfake nude images, and unfortunately, she continues to fight to get these images removed from the internet. However, it's not just celebrities like Sauchel who are facing the harms of this new technology. Reports of similar abuse have been cited from high school students in New Jersey all the way to children in Spain. This is an issue that is relevant no matter where you're at in the world. And so with that, I'm excited to now introduce you to our speakers for today's webinar. First up, we have Dr. Rebecca Portnoff, Thorn's Vice President of Data Science, who will really lift the veil on how AI works, how bad actors are seizing this moment, and how we at Thorn are using the exact same technology to protect children at scale. We will then hear from longtime Thorn supporter and the CEO of FCLT Global, Sarah Williamson, who will share what inspires her continued support of Thorn and what gives her hope. So with that, Rebecca, I will now pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I appreciate that introduction. So I want to start by making sure that all of us here go into this discussion with the same baseline understanding of this technology. So I'll just give an upfront apology to those of you who are already familiar with this background or may feel that you have accidentally been trapped in a computer science class. I'll start by saying machine learning AI, it's not new. The underlying statistics and concepts of automated learning have been researched and around for decades. These technologies are deployed in so many different settings today to prioritize and triage data, to conduct large-scale data analysis, to detect anomalies in systems. The list can go on and on. Now, where we are seeing new ground is around the generative aspect of generative AI. Advancements in large language models and diffusion models have opened the door for machine learning AI that can now generate content across all different data modalities: text, images, video, and audio. Next slide, please. Now, generative AI is not possible without deep learning. Deep learning sits squarely in machine learning, the process of training an AI model to learn a concept from a data set so that it can then automatically make predictions based on properties that it has learned from. I'm so sorry about that. My computer decided to restart itself. I'm hoping that I'm back online and folks are able to hear me. Awesome. All right. So then I will keep us going here. So we were talking about deep learning. We were talking about how generative AI isn't possible without deep learning, and the key new advancement that deep learning does when it comes to building off of machine learning is it unlocks the power of big data. So in this case, you may have heard the phrase neural network architectures. These are model architectures inspired by the human brain in combination with increasing computational efficiency. It's the two of these advancements that have made it possible to train really big models with billions of parameters on enormous data sets. Now, how do language models fit into all of this? These are also deep learning. They're neural network-based models. Language models are trained to be able to capture the relationship between words. So for example, let's say that I have these three sentences. The first one is, I found some gold by the riverbank. The second sentence is, it's muddiest close to the bank. And the third sentence is, I stole some gold from the bank. A language model is trained to know that the word bank in the first two sentences refers to the same type of bank that's by a river, but that in the third sentence, the word bank refers to an entirely different concept. And the way that it learns these concepts is by training on a huge amount of written text. So large language models are a term that get thrown about a lot these days. These are exactly the same as language models, just large. There are more parameters in the model, and it's trained on more data. Now, hopefully, it's a pretty intuitive leap from how you can use a large language model to understand how likely a sentence is to appear in the real world, to then use one to generate a sentence that is likely to appear in the real world, and in fact, generate a sentence that's going to make sense to a human as a response to whatever they just wrote or spoke. Now, what about image and video generation? I mentioned diffusion models earlier. These are one of the best known generative models for image and video generation. Diffusion models work by training a neural network, again, with successively noisier images where you're adding sampled Gaussian noise to these images. And then you train the network to learn to reverse this noising process. So after all of this training, you have a diffusion model that can generate data, an image or a video, by just giving it randomly sampled noise, because it's learned how to turn this noise into an image. So to combine these two concepts, to get a text-to-image model, you can use large language models and diffusion models. That's how you get something like OpenAI's DALL-E product or Stability AI's Stable Diffusion product, what's called a text-to-image model, where the model is producing images that match the text description provided by the human user. And that same concept applies for example, OpenAI's Sora, a text-to-video model, where the model can produce up to a minute of high-fidelity video. Now here I'm showing an example of what all of that technology can look like in practice. Now first, let me introduce you to just one more term, fine-tuning. Fine-tuning refers to taking one of these models, predictive or generative AI, and then training it with specifically curated data to make it particularly good at a given task. So on the left here, what you're seeing is an image that was generated with a text-to-image model using a particular prompt and a particular model. That exact same model was then fine-tuned with pictures of Audrey Hepburn to make the model better at producing images that more closely resemble Audrey Hepburn. And you can see the results in the image in the middle. With the fine-tuned model, using the exact same text prompt as for the image on the left, the picture now much more closely resembles Audrey Hepburn. Now, that same model was then fine-tuned again, but this time with the goal of making the model's outputs look younger. And you can see the results in the image in the right. Using that exact same text prompt, but with the newly fine-tuned model, the resulting image does in fact appear younger. So it may be apparent at this point that all of this has pretty serious implications for child safety. This technology is easy to use, it's scalable, and it produces photorealistic content. What we are seeing today is that bad actors are misusing generative AI to further sexual harms against children. Bad actors are using this technology today to create sexual content depicting children. Victim identification is already a needle in the haystack problem. We have frontline defenders sifting through huge amounts of content to find the child in an active abuse situation. And just to give you a sense of the scale, the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, which is the national clearinghouse for these types of reports, received reports containing over 88 million files of suspected child sexual abuse material in 2022 alone. So anything that grows that haystack further is a problem. This is particularly troubling, given the ability for these technologies to produce photorealistic content and to produce that content at scale, making it even more difficult to determine what in that haystack of content represents a new victim, a known victim, or a fictional child generated from the likeness of millions of actual children in the training data set. Now, this technology has impact on re-victimization as well. We are seeing that bad actors are fine-tuning open source and broadly shared models on existing child sexual abuse material to generate additional explicit images of these children. They collaborate to make these synthetic images match the exact likeness of the child, but produce new poses, acts, and egregious content like sexual violence. These children have already been through the horrific. They've experienced this abuse, they've had that abuse be documented, and now having that abuse get used to create more abusive material of them, it's truly re-victimization at the next level. Finally, we are seeing that bad actors are using these technologies to scale efforts to newly victimized children. They use generative AI to sexualize benign imagery of children, maybe a photo that a kid has shared on a social media platform somewhere, and then blackmail these children into either generating more sexual content or paying some kind of financial compensation. We are further seeing more reports of minor-to-minor harassment and bullying, where minors will generate sexualized content of their peers using these same technologies. Now, unfortunately, the sad reality is that this type of misuse isn't localized just to images and videos. It shows up across all data modalities, including text. Now, on the screen there, what you see is a baseline statistic. Without generative AI in the picture, 2 in 5 kids have experienced being approached online by someone who they thought might have been trying to manipulate and befriend them. In other words, grooming. Now, when we layer in generative AI, what we are observing is bad actors using this technology to practice how to build harmful relationships with children, to generate graphic descriptions of child sexual abuse, to engage in fantasy sexual roleplay with chatbots mimicking the voice of children. This type of misuse can lower the barrier for harms, normalizing abuse scenarios and abusive acts. But in the same way that you can scale AI for harm, you can also scale it for good. Thorn has spent the last 12 years using machine learning and AI to combat the issue of child sexual abuse, building out solutions to prevent future harms. We do that by looking at 3 different intervention points: accelerating victim identification, stopping re-victimization, the viral spread of child sexual abuse material, and preventing abuse from occurring in the first place. Thorn has built a suite of image, video, and text classifiers to detect sexual harms against children, whether that be new child sexual abuse material that could depict a child in active harm's way, or text where a bad actor is soliciting child sexual abuse material, or a viral video of child sexual abuse material that's getting shared over and over again. Our solutions are built to arm frontline defenders against the scale of the material that they are facing. Now, I've dedicated my entire career to building tools and driving initiatives to defend children from sexual abuse. So I've had the privilege and the honor of seeing firsthand how machine learning and AI can and does make a difference, how it unlocks the power of rapid prioritization and triage of abuse material across all the data domains in which it manifests, empowering frontline defenders to combat child sexual abuse at scale. But this type of development is never one and done. Machine learning AI is inherently iterative. It requires maintenance of the technology that's been built. That's one of the reasons why collaboration is really near and dear to my heart and is also so critical in this type of work. If our partners are seeing bad actors change some element of the content to make detection more difficult, or if they're observing trends in false positives or negatives, we need to know about that so that we can update our models in response. We work collaboratively across data science, product, and engineering to ensure that we're building the right solutions for the moment, while always leaning into our research roots to understand what emerging threats we may need to tackle next. This type of work, again, requires collaboration, both inside and definitely outside the organization. It requires engaging deeply with frontline defenders, educating policymakers, conducting rigorous and regular measurement of prevalence of abuse material, and aligning across the tech ecosystem. And with generative AI, we're doing all of that at once. We are bringing early awareness of an emerging threat by publishing and broadcasting this emerging threat to the child safety ecosystem and beyond. We're doing this together in collaboration with our peers, publishing with the Stanford Internet Observatory, speaking at the White House along institutions like the Internet Watch Foundation and NCMEC, presenting to technical and research teams at UNICEF, and more. We're also using our existing solutions to meet the moment. Our hashing and matching solutions are deployed at generative AI companies to detect at the inputs of their closed source systems to find any child sexual abuse material that bad actors may upload to try to generate more abuse material. Thorn's child sexual abuse material classifier and our hashing and matching solutions are also being used to clean training datasets, detecting and empowering those well-intentioned actors to remove this abuse material from their training data so that their models are less capable of producing AI-generated CSAM. We're creating new services to meet the moment as well, like Thorn's red teaming, to ensure that generative AI models are iteratively stress tested for their capability to produce AI-generated CSAM and other harmful child sexual abuse content. Because in the same way that model development is inherently iterative, model assessment should also be iterative. We are working to equip the ecosystem with tactical guidance on safety by design across the entire machine learning AI lifecycle of develop, deploy, and maintain to prevent the misuse of these generative AI models to further child sexual abuse. And I just want to take a moment to focus on that maintain element. You may have seen Nicholas Kristof's recent article in the New York Times, where he shines a light on the unfortunate reality that not only are these generative AI technologies being misused to sexualize benign imagery of children and adults, but also that search engines are acting as an accelerant, making it tremendously easy to find these types of apps and services to create increasingly more degrading and disturbing content. While he and I were talking for that article, there were two things that I was really glad to get the opportunity to highlight. Maintenance of mitigations must include this long tail of distribution, where we are actively removing access to these types of apps and services, and with significantly more rigorous curating of training datasets and other mitigations, we can develop these generative AI models such that they are less capable of producing this type of abuse material. Now, we still have a window of opportunity to make a difference here. And so we're speaking with these leading generative AI companies, we're engaging with policymakers and standard-setting institutions like NIST to ensure that in this moment, as generative AI technology emerges, These technologies are developed, deployed, and maintained explicitly with child safety in mind. So we've talked a lot about the AI landscape, how it works, and some of the harms. And we've also provided some insight into Thorn's technology solutions and how we're coordinating our efforts to address this issue at scale. But what can you as a parent do, a parent or a caregiver, to help protect the kids in your life? The biggest thing that we want to highlight that you can do is to create an open and judgment-free environment at home. This is going to make your child much more likely to come to you in the event that they do encounter some online harms. It's also important to familiarize yourself with their world and the apps that they're using. Every app is different to some extent, and understanding the function and the appeal for your child will help you to relate to and support their experience, such as helping them report harmful users or content. It also can be valuable to look into the privacy controls that are available on the apps that they're using, to talk to your child about the type of information that they share online and the permanence of what gets shared. And finally, to consider your own online habits to avoid oversharing personal details and photos of the children in your lives. Now, to learn more about what you can do to protect the kids in your life, I encourage you to check out our Thorn for Parents resource by scanning the QR code on this slide or visiting the link in this chat. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I now want to pass things over to our longtime supporter, Sarah Williamson, a parent herself, who will share what inspires her to continue giving to Thorn and what gives her hope.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for that terrific presentation. I learn something every time I speak with you all. So thank you for including me. I have been involved in Thorn as a defender, as it's called, for about 10 years. And in the early days, Thorn was one of the first to recognize that technology could really fuel the demand for child sexual exploitation. So whether that was trafficking or whether that was child sexual abuse material, they were really one of the pioneers in that, but also in recognizing that technology could be used to fight it, so that you could fight fire with fire, if you will. And so, as Rebecca has said, they've spent the last dozen years or so enabling these technologies. And of course, as everything in technology, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, which is the bad actors have a technology, then the technology improves again and again. So I think one of the things I really took away from Rebecca's points today is that we need to continue to build the technology that can enable people around the globe to work together. These images, as you know, can go around the world in seconds, and also to work with people in all of those places to tackle this issue. So the research has been used to advise CEOs of large tech companies on what to do about this. It's involved in global and national policy discussions from our own Senate to the EU. And it is trying to knit people together around the world who care about this issue. But as you can imagine, there's still a lot more to do. So why do I support Thorn still after all of this time? The simple and maybe perhaps personal reason now is I have a 3-year-old granddaughter. But a much broader and more important reason, I think, is that I believe technology should be used to educate and empower our children, not abuse them. But surprisingly, this is not a universally held view, and it should be. So what can we do together to assist Thorn? If we can go to the next page, the first thing we can do is make a gift. There is a lot of need here, and if you have the capability to make a gift, please do that. Connect with a donor officer. You can use the QR code, but our money really matters. The second is to educate yourself and your family and your friends about this issue. It is, as Lauren said at the beginning, a challenging issue. It is not, always cocktail conversation, but it's really important for people to understand that this is an issue that matters, and it's an issue that is vital to the health of our children. And then the third is to help Thorn connect to other people around the world who are working on this. One of the things that has been very interesting for me over this time is the collaboration and the support between Thorn and law enforcement. And so if we think about the way that law enforcement can use Thorn's tools, such as the CSAM classifier, if there are platforms that can be used that perhaps we're not using, think about where the connections can work, because this technology is very powerful and it's there to make law enforcement and others' jobs easier. So with that, again, thank you to Rebecca for giving us information here. And thank you to all of you at Thorn who have done this work, and to all of you online who support and engage in this challenging topic. So let me turn it back to Lauren with that, please.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. Really, really appreciate you sharing more about your background with Thorn. And honestly, it started giving me chills. It reminded me of my own why again for wanting to work in this issue space. So thank you for being a part of Thorn's journey for so long and continuing to put child safety at the forefront. Before we kick off the Q&A, I just want to make a quick announcement about some upcoming events we have here at Thorn. Like I mentioned earlier, this webinar is really part of a quarterly series, if you will, aimed at providing a deep dive into some of our emerging trends and Thorn's latest efforts to protect children. So please do stay tuned for details on our next webinar that is taking place in June. Also, next Thursday, April 4th, mark your calendars because we will be hosting a live stream on our Instagram page about the rise and impact of financial sextortion. We will be joined by a parent survivor who will courageously share their story to help other families avoid the same tragedy that they went through, as well as our own head of research here at Thorn and a special guest from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So we hope you can join us then as well. All right, I am now going to open us up for the Q&A session. If you have not already submitted any questions, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you all should see a button that says Q&A. Please click on that button, submit your questions there, and again, we will try to answer as many as possible. All right, let's see some questions rolling in. Okay. Rebecca, I think I have a question for you here. How, if at all, is voice cloning showing up in your work to groom kids or lure them into unsafe situations?
This is a great question. So I'll start by saying what we're observing from the voice spamming or voice spoofing, voice cloning is that it's still in this particular space more nascent than, for example, the image generation that we are observing. What that means from our perspective is, again, we have some opportunity to act in advance, to be preventative in our approach. Certainly outside of the child safety space, there are implications around voice cloning as well. But specific to child safety, what we're observing is that it's still nascent and that we have an opportunity in front of us to act before it becomes a problem.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Let's see. I've got another question for you as well. What skills and areas of knowledge would you say a person needs to help with software and programming with Thorn? And do you offer any internships?
I love that question. I'll start by saying, unfortunately, no, we don't offer internships. As far as the skills that are needed here at Thorn, definitely software engineering is on the list. I lead the data science team, and so I'm always happy to meet folks with a strong machine learning background or an interest in learning more about machine learning and how it can be used to have impact in this type of space. And then, of course, we have a broad range of other teams that do so much to help support the ecosystem. If you're a good fundraiser, that's definitely something that we look for in this space, wanting to have folks who are able to authentically communicate the importance of the issue and do it in a way that meets people where they are. That type of communication skill is also really impactful and powerful here. And then I know I got to give a plug for all of the amazing research that we do in this space, and that certainly consists of robust data, analytical skills, and familiarity with the issue ecosystem.
Awesome. Rebecca, do we have software tools to protect children from this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if we focus for the moment on AI-generated CSAM in particular, we are really pushing for this as a moment for safety by design, where the entire ecosystem of technology takes advantage of the window of opportunity we have to build these models in such a way that they are less capable of producing this kind of abuse material. And so that's really where our focus is on prevention. With that said, there's a lot of other implications around the misuse of generative AI outside of the child safety space, and we are observing that there's quite a lot of good work being done in those sectors on what it looks like to be able to downstream, for example, downstream detect the presence of AI manipulation or detect that a piece of content was AI generated. And so I'm a big fan of using tools that work in our space that have already been built. But I'm an even bigger fan of prioritizing prevention because that to me is just core to making sure that we're doing everything we can to meet these kids' needs where they are.
Great. And Rebecca, I'm coming at you again. Where is federal law, would you say, where is federal law at for generative AI CSAM that uses the likeness but not actual images of real children?
Now, this is definitely a question that we get a lot, and I like to caveat that I'm not a lawyer, I'm a computer scientist, but with that caveat, what we are currently seeing is that federal regulation does cover AI-generated child sexual abuse material that is photorealistic, that the existing definition of child sexual abuse material encompasses that type of photorealistic content. If you look outside of the federal regulation to the state-by-state level, it can introduce more variety as different states have different types of regulation on the books on this topic.
Great. We have another question here about what sort of companies and government systems work with Thorn. And I can chime in and say that Thorn's kind of bread and butter is equipping law enforcement and other NGOs with tools and equipping tech platforms with tools to detect child sexual abuse material. We also advocate for policy, as I mentioned earlier. But Rebecca, do you have anything else to add on to that?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive. I know that our posture here is we want to be working with the folks that we want to be empowering the frontline defenders, and that is pretty core to our mission.
Okay, we have another question here from a parent and a technologist. What should I be doing to keep my daughters, 4 years old and 9 months, safe as they start their introductions into technology and the internet?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think the one thing that I would really strongly reinforce is building that trust relationship, that if you have that trust relationship established, then if and when something happens, they will know that you're a person and a voice that they can come to and they can engage with to get help rather than feeling like they need to deal with this by themselves.
Right. And then Rebecca, with AI generated, being generated typically from an existing image, is there a channel for reporting to help get it removed, or how does that typically work?
Yeah, this is another great question. So I would say that NCMEC is the National Clearinghouse for reports of this kind of content. They do have a flag that you can use when submitting your report that indicates that this is generative AI content. And if this is content that's depicting a minor, they are absolutely the right group to be helping to take it down.
Great. You guys are doing great with your questions. Rebecca's going to need some water here in a minute. Rebecca, is there some kind of watermark or metadata on generative AI samples so that we can identify the content origin or even if it's AI generated at all?
I love this question. So this to me speaks directly to how we want to be prioritizing upstream interventions as much as possible, rather than sort of playing whack-a-mole detection space. And I think what I would say is the broader tech ecosystem is still figuring out what that's going to look like, but there have been a lot of really solid efforts to that end. And one particular effort that I'll highlight is with an organization called C2PA, the Content Authenticity Initiative. Some of you may be familiar with it already. their focus is primarily in the mis and disinformation space, but the core of it is to try to establish standards for what it looks like to have that type of indirect disclosure, the type of provenance be a part of the content from the get-go. So still early days, but I am seeing hopeful movement in the right direction when it comes to upstream intervention specifically for indirect disclosure.
Sure, sure. And how can AI apps prevent the creation of illegal material involving children, would you say?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when it comes to prevention, I think there's a couple of thoughts that I have, or preventing the creation. So one thought is in a closed source ecosystem, and this is now where you have a generative AI model that is in a contained environment. You can be detecting at the inputs and the outputs to ensure that, for example, you're catching when a user maybe is trying to generate this type of material, and then also detecting at the outputs for whether or not a user has successfully generated this type of material. So there are certainly opportunities to be doing these types of things, and they look different depending on how you're running your business or how you are releasing your technology.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and this next question, it's something I even feel personally in my own life with friends having children and but also being very active on social media. Do you recommend avoiding putting pictures of children or adults online, such as on social media, due to the possibility of deepfakes being generated?
Yeah, this is definitely a question that I think all of us will have to wrestle with if we haven't already been wrestling with it, to Lauren's point. From my perspective, I can completely understand why a parent or a caregiver of a child would want to celebrate their kid in this way by sharing this kind of content, but it comes with risks. So I can tell you that for my part, I do avoid putting these kinds of pictures online. That's the personal choice that I've made. I know for other parents that I respect, what they've done instead is had private environments where maybe you have like you and your grandma, the people that you trust in your life, and those are the folks that you allow to have access to these kinds of images and pictures. But I certainly can appreciate why it's a question that all of us are going to have to keep asking.
Absolutely. And then let's see. What would you say are the most important guardrails companies that are using AI should put in place in order to protect children?
This is another one of my favorite questions to answer these days. So I mentioned earlier in the session that we think of safety by design as opportunity across the entire life cycle of machine learning AI, develop, deploy, and maintain. So I tend to think about key opportunities in each of these different aspects of model creation. So if we talk about developing, I mentioned earlier how companies are using some of Thorn's technologies to do exactly this mitigation here, which is to ensure that their training data sets are robustly and rigorously cleaned of abuse material. I think a similar concept to that is to be responsible in how you're sourcing your training data. That's actually a very standard tenet in responsible AI is be thoughtful about where you're sourcing your training data. And that exact same thing applies here. If you're scraping the whole world of the internet to train your model, then you are going to end up with some abuse material in your training data set. So that thoughtfulness is something that I also would encourage. We talked about indirect disclosure and content provenance, incorporating that type of, whether or not it be watermarking or other sorts of metadata, incorporating it as far upstream as possible in the image generation process itself so that it's more robust to bad actor manipulation. That's also a key intervention point that we see. When it comes to deploy, I think I've already talked about detecting at the inputs and the outputs for closed source model developers. I think if we start looking towards model providers, and I told you that I would love this question, so someone cut me off if I'm talking too much, but when we talk about model providers, I think there's another opportunity here to be practicing scalable assessments of models to understand their propensity or their capabilities of producing this type of abuse material before they get hosted on your platform, so that these model hosting platforms can act almost as a choke point in the ecosystem where they're not contributing to the broader spread of these types of models that maybe have even been built to produce this material, but instead are acting as that choke point in the ecosystem. And then for the maintain one, I think I already got an opportunity earlier to mention one of the most critical interventions that I see, which is in ensuring that search engines are doing their part to not accelerate the proliferation of apps and services that allow for the nudifying and sexualizing of benign content.
Great, great. And we have had so many awesome questions coming through. Thank you all so much for putting those into the chat. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of those today, but we really appreciate it. Rebecca, I'm going to ask one more question before we wrap things up here. Is Safer by Thorn able to detect new, novel AI-generated images since they would not have known hashes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start by saying that Safer's Thorn offers both hashing and matching and the CSAM classifier. So the CSAM classifier is currently our best tool to detect new child sexual abuse material that would not yet appear on a hashing and matching list. Now, when it comes to AI-generated child sexual abuse material in particular, it's still early days, but what we are observing, and again, early days, what we're observing is that the Thorn's CSAM classifier will perform well on photorealistic AIG CSAM in the same way that it performs on child sexual abuse material, but it's early days for that type of assessment and understanding.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks so much. Well, folks, that concludes our webinar for today. A big, big thank you to our speakers, Sarah and Rebecca. Also, a big thanks to you all for being brave and for perhaps stepping outside of your comfort zone to join us in this conversation today. We are just so grateful, and it's truly because of supporters like yourselves that we are able to continue on doing this important work. So thank you again. We are going to launch a quick 3-question poll. I promise, just 3 questions that will take everyone about 1 minute. So if you don't mind sharing your feedback on what you liked or didn't like about this webinar before jumping off, we'd be very appreciative. Otherwise, thank you again. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you next time.